The hell are you supposed to be?
I'm Batman. I'm vengeance, I mean. I'm Batman, but I'm vengeance. Why did you use the 60s sound effect? I'm not being campy Batman, I'm trying to be cool Batman.
The killer left this for the Batman. Why is he writing to you? You came. I've been trying to reach you.
Do you like Batman? Well, you damn well better, because DC is out of ideas again, which means we're getting another Batman movie. This time, it's darker and grittier than ever before. Until they reboot it next time, and it's darker and grittier and more realistic again. Well, you can turn off the bat signal now because the Batman has finally arrived. I'm keeping the costume on though. That's right, Matt Reeves has finally delivered his solo Batman film to us, rebooted outside the regular DC continuity, whatever the regular DC continuity even is anymore, and again giving us an origin story that isn't really the origin story you might expect. And I think the level of hype for this movie is absolutely insane. I think it's hard to argue against that. It just looked damn near perfect. And I include myself among the hype. This was my most anticipated film of this year. But I do wonder if perhaps I overhyped it for myself, because for me personally, I'm not sure the Batman was equal to the sum of its parts. Now before you start the death threats and the dislikes, let me just say, I really did like this movie. I just didn't love it the way I wanted to. But there is undoubtedly a lot of things to love. In fact, I would say in some ways, it's the best Batman movie. In that, this is the first film where I feel like you were watching the world's greatest detective in action in this total hellscape of a city that is Gotham. I don't think you felt like that ever before. I mean, this is really a fleshed out underworld of criminals and gangsters, and it looks absolutely amazing. I also loved the characterization of Batman in this. We don't have him at his year one phase, it's more of a year two, in that this is a character who isn't at his beginning, but it's also not the Batman we come to know. He's still trying to get the hang of his gear and his gadgets, kind of consistently adding to them or trying to figure out what will work, and you can kind of see traces of where that gadget will eventually end up in the regular Batman lore. We also have a character who hasn't really mastered the balance between being Bruce Wayne and being the Batman, and at times he's an absolute psychopath that goes too far. And I would say the arc of the film, which isn't always the primary focus, is that he's trying to figure out what the Batman needs to be to help this city, because to a certain degree, what he's doing isn't working. I say not always focused because the story does feel very unfocused at times, which is fine. That's kind of the nature of a noir detective story, in that it is very meandering, which I will say, as mentioned, does a great job of setting up the world and the characters, but does affect the plot in that sometimes it feels a little bit scattered and sporadically interesting. And I think the pacing of the film is just truly bizarre. It starts off strong, then kind of slows down for a while. There's a lot of detours in the plot, and then it sort of speeds up again, and then goes into an ending which is entertaining, but I will also say feels very detached from the rest of the film. As a result of the type of film they're going for, there might be a bit less action than you might expect, but I will say that what we got was constantly engaging and very intense and even claustrophobic at times, which definitely works for this version of Batman, who's meant to be kind of in over his head. The fight scenes we got were very kind of brutal and even sloppy at times, which again works with the version of the character that's trying to find his footing as a vigilante. The standout action scene, though, a lot of people are going to take away with is the chase scene with our new Batmobile, which after seeing it, I totally understand what Matt Reeves meant when he said he was modelling it after Christine. I will say if I had a complaint about that scene, it's maybe a little bit too boxed in, maybe a bit too claustrophobic. I feel like the geography of the scene isn't always clear, and maybe a few wide shots could have helped establish the layout, but then again, it was still one of the absolute highlights of the film for me. As mentioned, the characters and performances is an area where the Batman really does shine. Pattinson does a really good job here. He's got that kind of intense, brooding nature that really suits his Batman character. Now, I have heard people suggest that it's not really very distinct as Batman and as Bruce Wayne, but I think that's exactly the point here, and I think that's something we're going to see develop over sequels, which I'm certainly looking forward to. Zoe Kravitz as Catwoman does a fantastic job. I think she's probably the best Catwoman, certainly the most comic accurate one, and I really loved her portrayal here. I would say some of her dialogue is maybe a little bit hokey compared to the rest of the film, but overall, I thought she did a fantastic job. I want to see more of her Catwoman, and I thought she had excellent chemistry with Robert Pattinson. Batman's accomplices in this are also pretty strong. I thought Jeffrey Wright did a great job as Gordon, and he played off Batman really well in this. I think he's probably more front and center than any previous Gordon, and certainly works a lot closer with Batman than any of the rest of them from memory. I think if there's one minor complaint, and it's a very, very minor complaint, I would like to have seen a little bit more of an explanation of how they became so trusting of each other, because, I mean, normally it's that GCPD is corrupt, but it seems like Gordon was a bit less aware of that in this film. And also it feels like he put a lot on the line for Batman here, based on seemingly not a lot. But again, that's a very minor nitpick because it's an accepted part of Batman lore that I was just willing to accept. I just would have liked to see it fleshed out maybe a little bit more. Andy Serkis plays Alfred, and honestly one of my complaints about the film is that he's just not in it enough. I think there's a lot of potential with his version, but honestly it feels like he's a little bit wasted. Now, he does have some good scenes. There's one scene in particular that kind of provides some of the emotional grounding that I think the film does need. But also, to make it even stranger, is that they have another housekeeper in Wayne Manor in this. Dory, I think her name is. She reminds me of Aunt Harriet from the Batman 66 days, which is just a totally unnecessary and pointless addition, aside from maybe one scene. Very strange, especially when Andy Serkis feels so underserved in the film. Villain-wise, the film is absolutely stacked. We, of course, have Colin Farrell as the Penguin, who, it's been well documented by now, is barely recognisable. They did a great job on the makeup for him here. And the dude is just having so much fun. He's incredibly over the top. He's just this totally cliched gangster, but not to the point where it's detracted from the movie. He's just very entertaining, and it certainly works as a proto version of Cobblepot. We also have John Turturro as Carmine Falcone, who's fine. He's just a kind of a standard gangster. He's not super pivotal, but I felt he served the story well. And then, of course, we have our main villain, the Riddler. Paul Dano as the Riddler, I liked, but I thought it was a little bit broad. I mean, I just thought it was a very obvious performance as the Riddler, and he's very tangential to the film. Like, his presence is felt throughout, but he's never really there explicitly. If you think like John Doe in Seven, which is clearly very much inspired this film, along with Fincher's Zodiac, and Saw, and some of the Arkham games. Matt Reeves did his homework. There's a lot of influences here, but I just thought there was just a very expected take on the character for me. There was no real surprises in the performance of the Riddler, or in the characterization, or even the motivations I thought were quite thin for the character. And I do think having a villain that isn't kind of omnipresent in the film helped the film in some ways, and that it allowed us to focus on expanding this world and these characters and focusing on Batman. Like I said, I thought the characterization of Batman was excellent in this, but I do think it made the Riddler less interesting. And I certainly think it led to the film having a last act that felt a little bit lacking as a result. On a technical level, the film is outstanding. The cinematography has a real dark beauty to it at times, and a sort of gritty intensity to it at other times. I think it has a real stylized gothic look that is rather haunting. And I would say tonally, it's probably the darkest Batman film to date. Like, there's no levity in the film, which might annoy some people. I was totally fine with that. I think the score was maybe a little bit repetitive at times, but it was also appropriately moody, atmospheric, and imposing. And certainly Michael Giacchino's new Batman score, that sounds like this. Those four notes are going to be burnt into your head as you walk around late at night thinking you're far cooler than you are. If I had some other minor quibbles, I would say the colour palette for the film is very drab. It's all reds and browns. And I'm not saying I want to return to the Schumacher days, but it feels like we dump on the Marvel movies for being dull visually. And this one, it's like, come on, man, you couldn't give the Riddler maybe a bit of green or something, or just made it a little bit more visually interesting at times. I also think that the film is too long. There is some stuff I think you could have cut out of this. It definitely feels like a film that could have had a tighter edit, because it does at times feel a bit slow and meandering. I also feel like it's very strange that the movie has narration at times, which I just don't think adds anything and felt very out of place. And then there's a scene I can't talk about for spoilers that sort of sets things up for the future, and I thought it was really corny, didn't feel like it belonged in the movie, and honestly, what it sets up I hope doesn't come to fruition, because it feels like something that's been done to death. And even for my minor complaints, and just to be clear, all my complaints are very minor, one of the credits I can give the Batman is it feels like a Batman film we've never seen before. For all my nitpicks and quibbles, the Batman has enough fresh ideas and nails enough of the Batman character and lore that it's very hard not to get invested in. And while not everything is a slam dunk, it hits enough of the right notes that it's an easy recommend to Batman fans and people who are normally not in to the Caped Crusader, and if nothing else, it's a very solid foundation for this iteration of the character, the rogues, and the city of Gotham that they all inhabit. And I will say, despite my minor misgivings, this is probably my third favourite Batman film, and I could certainly see it moving up after subsequent viewings, which I definitely intend to do soon. So riddle me this: on what does an old camera feed, and what does a thriving cinema always need? See what I did with that riddle there? Like, you put film in the camera, right? You know, in old cameras, not now. You don't need to do it now unless you're using, you know, a camera that needs film. And cinemas need good films to make money, but they don't have to be good films. Sometimes, you know, sometimes films just make money when they're good or bad. Sometimes, you know.